I want to welcome everybody who's here. Thank you for joining us on this lovely day in Seattle. I want to start with a moment and acknowledge, as we like to here at the University of Washington, that the University of Washington is on the lands of the Coast Salish peoples, the land which touches the shared waters of the tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We like to honor people whose land this is and reflect on what that means for us here as users of the land. And I'm really grateful that Pinky Mondal has agreed to join us all the way from Delaware. The trip was grueling, I'm sure. And Pinky and I, you probably heard, we're just reflecting on how we met 13 years ago now at the University of Florida. Pinky did her PhD at the University of Florida and went to a postdoc position at Columbia University and worked with she worked with a colleague and friend at Florida, Jane Southworth, and another colleague and friend at Columbia, Ruth DeFries. So I'm particularly pleased that we have you here, and we've interacted through your work. And I just realized you sent me a bio, and I don't have it in front of me. Sorry about that. We've interacted through the NASA Land Cover Land Use Change Program. Currently, Pinky leads the Earth Observation and Sustainable Ecosystem and Livelihood Research Group at the University of Delaware, where she's an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Spatial Sciences, with a joint appointment in the Department of Plant and Soil Sciences. She's a geospatial data scientist interested in the dynamics of coupled natural and human systems. Her PhD, as I mentioned, is from Florida in land change science, and coming most recently from Columbia University. So please join me in welcoming Pinky Mondal to the SEFS seminar series. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us here today. We are just discussing Zoom fatigue is real, and we are all survivors. So I will try to keep it short. Although I have to warn you, when talking about my research, I get very passionate. So please bear with me. I just thought that it would be a nice time for me to discuss some of my recently published and some ongoing research looking at agriculture in a water-challenged world. So thank you, Dan, for giving a great introduction. And, those are the best introduction that, we made 13 years ago at this bar or that restaurants. But there are other interesting stuff I wanted to share with all of you today. I was born and raised in urban India. My hometown is Kolkata. I speak the same language as people in Bangladesh, Bangla. I also speak Hindi other than English. I have 2 degrees in geology, and very different worlds. But while I was doing my master's in applied geology, I saw the light and I started thinking about land use, land cover change, how satellite remote sensing can be used to learn about our environment. So I came here in the US to do my PhD. My PhD was on forest cover change in India and in a tiger reserve. For my first postdoc at UMass, I looked at private forests in the US, so a lot of forest connections. But then for my second postdoc at Columbia, as Dan mentioned, it took me back to India, in central India, in a landscape looking at climate impacts on agriculture. It was interesting because, it was very close to my PhD study site, the Tiger Reserve. Those are tiny patches of forests embedded within agricultural matrix. So you cannot really study just forest or just agriculture. It's such an integrated system with forest, wetlands and marsh and meadows and, wonderful wildlife. It's a fascinating landscape. So I was very happy to get back to that landscape. And then one thing led to the other, one LC-LUC to another LC-LUC. And now I lead or co-lead multiple projects looking at smallholder agricultural systems across the world. So I have been working in Vietnam, in India, not smallholder, but agricultural system in the US. I find this really interesting and fascinating because it's not just the natural systems we are studying here. We are also studying how humans are changing this environment. It's very close-knit, a system. I essentially study spatial distribution because my background and training has been in satellite remote sensing and GIS. But this just gives me so many different directions, and I'm interested in all of them. So, for example, I have studied weather variability and how that impacts smallholders' decision making, how socioeconomic conditions of farmers that change their decisions and down the line change the landscape, how that ties back to the well-being of these farmers, but also how that impact the wildlife in the surrounding areas. Recently, a lot of my work has been kind of leading towards these adaptation strategies because we all know we are in a world that's rapidly changing in many different ways. So this is really fascinating. There are so many different components into this problem or this issue. Today, I'm going to talk about two very contrasting stories. As I said, I'm telling you stories today, essentially. So I hope you will bear with me. So smallholders, who are these smallholders? Essentially, they are farmers who own very small patches of lands. So I use a definition of farmers who own less than 2 hectares of land. But other researchers have used definitions like the one here, where that's very small, and then small would be 2 to 5 hectares. But nevertheless, they are small holding farmers. As you can see from this map, all these areas under orange and red, especially here, if you can see my cursor here in parts of Africa, but mostly Southeast Asia, those are dominated by smallholders. And they are important, not because they're human beings. They, of course, are human beings, and we should definitely focus on their overall well-being, but more so because they give us the food that we eat. They produce 70% of food calories worldwide. They produce more than 50% of staple crops. Over 380 million households, they are smallholders. So they go through many different challenges. And if we can solve or at least attempt to solve some of these challenges, that's a huge population, sample population. We would probably be able to fix a lot of these SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goal challenges. So looking at this, now you probably know why they're important or why smallholder agricultural systems are important. As I said, they have many different challenges, but today I'm just going to focus on water. And as I said, coming from very two different backgrounds and two different systems. Now, whenever I study smallholder agricultural system, I have two very broad questions. The first one is essentially a biophysical one, like how do climate extremes affect food production? Now, obviously, this is important because we need food, for sustainability, but the climate extremes like flood and drought, those are increasing in intensity, in frequency, so it will impact food production. The second question has to do more with how we are adapting to this. There are mitigation strategies, there are adaptation strategies. Some are short term, some are longer term. All are important, but depending on where we are, specifically geography and the culture and preferences, that very much dictate how crop yield and cropped area will vary, depending on the future scenarios. So starting from there, some of my earlier work has focused in India. Not because I am from India, of course I am, but other than that, India, as I said, it's just such a diverse and fascinating country. Let's talk about some numbers. India, as we know, it has over 1.3 billion people. Size-wise, it's 1/3 of the United States. So it's a very dense country. 58% of our people, they depend on agriculture, one way or the other. We have landowners, we also have agricultural laborers. So they directly depend on agriculture. 86% of Indian farmers are smallholders, meaning they own less than 2 hectares of farmland. Area-wise, 47% of these areas are managed by smallholders. They produce overall 10% of global food production, yet they are also consumers, right? They're not just producers, they're also consumers. We have close to 200 million farmers or people who are undernourished, meaning they do not have access to sufficient and nutritious food. What you see on the right of my slide, all these different pictures, those are from leading dailies in India. And the top right is actually taken by me, one of the summer fieldworks. You can see that there has been droughts, there has been floods, and many smallholder farmers, they actually use very non-mechanized ways to tend to their lands. So it's smallholders, they can be subsistence farmers, they can be semi-subsistence farmers. So if you look at the demography of Indian farmers, in some places, some locations, you will find wealthy farmers who are sort of large-scale farmers, have mechanization, but many places you will see farmers like the one person you see here who uses very old school methods and cows to prepare their fields. They are the ones who are the most vulnerable to the ongoing changes, be it market, be it climate, be it policy. So they are the vulnerable one. So that's where I started kind of getting interested in Indian agriculture. Now, if you look at the climate projections, they are not telling you a good story either, not a lot of hope. Well, depends on how you look at it. So this slide, you are seeing precipitation projections. So different scenarios, different projections, different estimates, but it could be that there 1.2% to 11.3% increase in precipitation. When I'm giving you these numbers, these are, sort of broad numbers. There are definitely spatial variations. Now, this could be a good thing for India, right? Because we are a rain-fed system. So more rain, the better it is, right? It's not, because what we are actually would be experiencing, and we have already started experiencing that, it's a lot of rain in a handful of days. So it's really extreme rain events and not constant rain, which is needed for sustaining agriculture. So it's actually making farmers' life quite difficult. Now, temperature wise, it's even worse, because we are seeing projections like 1.7 to close to 5 degrees centigrade increase. This is particularly difficult or challenging for some of the winter crops, which is also staple crop like wheat. Wheat has a very kind of niche range, temperature range that it requires, especially during winter. The projected increase in temperature is going to affect wheat production, and some of my earlier work has made that connection. Now, that's not the only challenge. One of the greatest challenges that Indian farmers are facing today is about the groundwater depletion. So the figure you see here, it's visually stunning. What's you seeing here, it's actually what we call mountains of groundwater depletion. So the higher the peaks are, the more depleted those regions are. Now, India is known as the world capital of groundwater depletion, and for valid reasons. The problem is groundwater provides 60% of India's irrigation supply. It is a rain-fed system, but that for the monsoon or the main crop growing season. The main season is between, let's say, between May and November. So that's the time when we get our monsoon rain. If you are a farmer, you will plant a crop, mostly paddy rice, sometimes some other crops too. The second term, which is the winter term, winter is very different in India. So it's mostly in 70s degree Fahrenheit, 70s or 80s. So farmers generally plant wheat, which is again a staple crop, different types of pulses, which is the edible seed of the legume family, and also different vegetables. Now that's the term the season when farmers need irrigation a lot, depending on where you are. The reason being is that in India, almost over half of India's land has already been taken for agriculture. So there's not much area left for agricultural expansion, but we still need to feed the growing population. So a lot of studies actually suggest to go for sustainable intensification, which means using the same land over and over again. Now, obviously, those are challenging task because you have to think about soil health, you have to think about farmers socioeconomic background, you have to think about water availability. So that's the reason that India's winter crop, or the second crop, is facing this challenge from groundwater depletion. Now if you look at the left picture here that I'm showing, that is showing groundwater availability by 2025, which is 4 years. It's difficult to fathom, but it's only 4 years away. All the areas in red and orange, those are the areas where there will be very low groundwater available for farming. Now in India, irrigation comes in many different forms. There are dug wells, which are like shallow wells, so less than 30 feet from the surface. There could be a deep tube well that's actually pumping the groundwater out. There would be canal, which are mostly surface water dependent. So there are groundwater dependent irrigation and there are surface water dependent irrigation, and the surface water directly connect us to the climate variability. Now, if you remember, we talked about the precipitation is supposed to be increasing. If that's the case, then that's good, right? Then we have more water through canal irrigation. Now, I will come back to that point in a few minutes. But before that, I wanted to show you another picture where I wanted to just touch upon the inequity issues in India. What you're seeing here, this person carrying this pipe to his land. So on the bottom left here, this is a canal, and then a wealthy farmer would have a motorized pump that will pump the water from the canal, and then using these pipes, they will water the fields. Now, if you have money, you will purchase this. You would also rent this out. So other farmers who do not have money to purchase this motorized pump, they will pay this wealthier farmer, not very wealthy, but wealthier, like hourly basis. But the problem is, what if your farm is further away from the canals? And that's what's happening here. You're seeing this person carrying this pipe. So this inequity comes not in the form of just wealth, but also geography, your location, right? Now, in this situation, we were thinking, okay, if groundwater is depleting, how much actually we depend on groundwater for irrigation in India? And if we lose all the groundwater, then do we have enough canal water that can supplement that groundwater irrigation? Now, these are very important questions because, as I said, we are already seeing this groundwater depletion. It's already happening. I have been talking to farmers since, over the last 10 years now. Depending on where you are, they are migrating to other areas. So let's say if the farmers are already in the northwestern part of India, they don't have anything left. So what they're doing, they're basically selling their lands or maybe keeping it if they're wealthy enough. And then they are moving in other places where they still have water left, groundwater left. So we wanted to ask this question, but we also wanted to have a nuanced take so that we just don't say anything like India as a whole, but also at a finer level. Because from our field experience, we know it's a very diverse country and we cannot just say, just one number for country as a whole. So we recently published this paper. But before I go in details what we found, I'd like to take you through some of the challenges that we faced. So if you remember from the last slide, I highlighted winter cropped area. As I said, winter crop, which is the second food crop, is important in terms of food security, also providing the farmers some, economic security. But other than that, We started there because we were honestly data limited. The reason being, India is, one of the tropical, semi-tropical countries. The primary season, which is the wet season, cloudy season. So everyone who have worked with satellite images, they know how challenging it could be if you try to find clear and clean satellite images during the cloudy season. So back then, we did not have free access to radar images that can see through clouds. Now we have it. So some of my work has been focusing on that. But back then, when we were looking at a timeline between 2001 and 2016, we started thinking about focusing on winter cropped area. So for that, we started with MODIS because we were looking at India at a national scale. It's a large area. We started with Enhanced Vegetation Index, which is a vegetation index pretty much similar to NDVI, but this is a little better in terms of canceling the soil related noise. How do we know what is a winter crop? So we looked at this satellite, this time series data, and within 1 year, if we found one peak in EVI, which is essentially a proxy for vegetation greenness. So we are looking at crop greenness. If we see one peak within 1 year, we identified that as a single crop. If we are seeing two peaks within 1 year, then we are identifying that pixel having two crops. It's possible that there are three peaks, rarely, but most of the times it's two peaks within a year. The second one definitely being the winter crop, and we can obviously verify that looking at the time of those images. So that's where we started, but that's just the one of the first challenges, because so these are all taken, like the three pictures, those are taken in the field during winter in January. So what you can see, a double crop field will look like this. So this is a wheat field. It will look green. If you see this is a fallow land. So there was paddy rice in the monsoon, but they didn't do anything during winter. So they just left it as fallow. So this is a single crop. These are easy to pick. This is challenging, the mixed crop. If you look at the size of a MODIS pixel, this is 250 meter by 250 meter. I overlaid a Landsat image on top of it, just to give you some ideas. Landsat has a spatial resolution of 30 meter. So, almost 8 Landsat pixels could fit within one MODIS pixel. And because we are dealing with smallholder farming, that was challenging to use MODIS for a system that is so diverse at a very fine level. So what we did, we actually used a scaling algorithm where we created kind of a data set that gives you percentage within each MODIS pixel. So if you have a MODIS pixel with a tiny bit of cropping, that will be 0% to 10% cropped. If it's a fully cropped pixel, it will be 100. So this little video, this little animation, it's showing you the variations in that data product. That data product is freely available through a NASA data center. As you can see here, the paper is also published. So you can, if you're interested, you can look into the scaling algorithm. But essentially, we were interested in looking at the changes, the spatial and temporal changes. So if you look at this animation, you'll see the northwestern, northeastern part, where all these huge ground depletion mountains are. Those are the stable winter crop area. So there, farmers are actually consistently doing at least two crops each year between 2001 to 2016. Other areas, especially central India, southwestern part of India, there, sometimes people will do a winter crop, sometimes they won't. And another paper that I published a couple of years ago that looked into the reason behind it, it is actually a mix of different factors. It could be that they couldn't afford the irrigation for during winter, so they skipped a couple of years. Maybe it was a bad monsoon year, so they did not have enough money to go for another cropping season that year. So it could be many different things. It could be labor availability. Many farmers, they actually supplement their income, so they migrate in nearby regions and during a non-primary season, which is winter season, and they come back home to their villages during monsoon season to plant. So there could be many different factors that are actually driving these variability. But this is where we started to understand where people are changing their farming behaviors. Now, to link that to irrigation, we considered very high admin level irrigation, which was difficult to get, but we finally got it at district level. So coming back to our initial questions where we asked how much we actually depend on groundwater, it turns out that 13% of the villages where farmers plant a winter crop are located in critically depleted regions. Now, the next one is a high number, 68%. We find that these villages may lose 68% of the winter crop in future if we lose the groundwater irrigation completely. Now, I have to warn you, this is a this is a worst case scenario, highly unlikely, but we wanted to have this upper bound to see what could have happened if we lose all the groundwater. But then the second question comes in that if we lose the groundwater and if we can supplement that with canal irrigation, which is dependent on surface water, can we recover? The simple answer is no, not completely. Canal irrigation cannot substitute for groundwater irrigation, especially in critically depleted regions. We would still see a reduction in winter crop between 20 to 24%, depending on where we are. The novelty of this work, I think, is the higher resolution of finding, but also the data set. So it's not just one number for all of India. And I think it's very important in terms of state level policies, because different states have different baseline right now, and they have different management strategies, different backgrounds of these farmers. So in terms of policy recommendations, obviously we cannot just say that don't irrigate or don't depend on this groundwater irrigation, because that's not going to happen. So we started thinking about what we could do. So one recommendation could be is that we could switch to less water intensive cereals. So we know, rice, it's very water intensive. And in some places, farmers do plant rice during winter, but also during summer, which is obviously the driest season. So we can obviously convert some of those areas into non-water intensive cereals. We can also adopt water saving technologies like sprinkler or drip irrigation. Right now there are subsidies for using groundwater irrigation. So obviously there's no incentive not to use it, other than that you are literally losing that out. But I think all of us everywhere, we have to think more about environment and what could happen to us down the line and not live in this moment. So I think there are some recommendations that could be useful. So this is the first story that I wanted to tell you, where we are losing water, but what if there's too much water and also not the right kind? So I'll bring you back to where I am right now. So this is a photo, a drone picture actually taken by my colleague, Dr. Jared Miller at UT. This is from, I believe it's from Maryland, Elmwood, Maryland. What you are seeing here, these white areas, these are salt crust. And you can see this is surrounding these crop fields. This is not new. We are seeing this in many areas, different countries, but also in the US, you can see a lot of land that is impacted by salt. About 42 million acres of irrigated land, it's impacted by salt. Globally, 6% land is impacted by salt. When we are talking about salt, there are two different types. So I wanted to make sure that I make that clear right now. So there's one salinity at the surface salinity. So sometimes that's visible at as salt crust. That's a soil surface. And then there's salinity in the soil root zone. That's actually more predictive of crop growth, but very difficult to measure. So you have to go out in the field and do little probes. Some of my colleagues are actually doing that, but it's very difficult to do that for a larger scale region, larger geographic region. And that's where we got into this project where we are mapping this salt water or salt crust on this farmland, essentially. Now, there are different drivers of salinization. It could be due to sea level rise. It could be due to storms, drought, water management. Some areas we use saline water for irrigation, or connectivity, how there are creeks and tidal lands. But the results, the consequences, it's not just farmland. We are seeing coastal forest loss, like ghost forest. We are seeing more invasive species. Those are salt tolerant. So it's basically replacing all the other vegetation. We are definitely seeing crop yield decline. We are seeing algal blooms and fish death and marsh migration. Now, many of us, I think 40% of the world population live in a coastal zone, especially coming from Delaware. We are literally like a coastal state. We are really, really flat. And the problem with this one is it's easy to look at flood when the towns are flooded, when you cannot get out of your house. That's very visible. But this one is sort of invisible flooding. So here we are seeing inward moving of saline water, making its way into farmlands, but it's not always that visible. So we have stakeholder meetings every year. We just had that last month. These are farmers we are talking about, and they're experiencing it. It's still challenging to talk about this issue. They want to see the maps, where it's happening, how can I see that? So that's where I started getting involved with this project, and my task was basically map the salt crust. Now, this is a drone image, right? And we cannot fly drone image all across Delmarva, hopefully at some point, but then think about all the computational time needed to process and classify. So from the very beginning, my goal was to utilize either aerial image or satellite image to map this. The problem is that the scale, again, it always comes to scale. These are very fine still. So I started with a NAIP image, which is 1 meter resolution. It's aerial images. I looked at 2011, 13, and 2016, 17, so pretty much the last decade. Started with Delmarva, 14 different counties. The idea was that we can, well, we are very hopeful back then. So we thought, well, we have, very high resolution NAIP images, how difficult it would be. What we gain with spatial resolution is that we lose with the spectral resolution and the temporal resolution. I mean, we know that, right, as students of remote sensing, but you still are very hopeful, naively so sometimes. The bands that we have through NAIP are like 4 bands: red, green, blue, and near infrared. So it essentially looks like this. So whatever you are seeing here, that's a NAIP image. So you can see, you can pick out like very detailed, differences. But then that's a challenge. The temporal resolution does not help with that because we only have some seasonal pictures taken by this aircraft. It's taken every 3 to 5 years, and then by the time it gets available, it's not near real time. So there are challenges with it. But there are other challenges too. Limited spectral bands mean you cannot really differentiate between similar looking land covers. So here we are looking at water, we are looking at rooftop, we are looking at beach soil, beach sand, and then we are also looking at bare cropland. Pretty much look the same. I mean, maybe I can differentiate that, but then you have to know that, you have to understand, realize that human brains are supercomputers. We are bringing in a lot of experiences. Computers are not that smart. We don't have seasonal data, so we cannot really pick out the difference in vegetations. High resolution comes with speckle effect. So it was picking up shadows and other non-significant or non-desirable classes that we really don't want. Machine learning comes with its own challenges. So those of you who are on social media, you probably have seen all the memes that are making its rounds regarding machine learning, pretty much the same. So this is one landscape. You have zoomed in views of different sections of this landscape. We have parking lots, we have streets, we have some salt crust, and we have some bare land. They all look exactly the same. They will be classified exactly the same. So with machine learning, that's the challenge. So we started with challenges coming from NAIP and machine learning. But we were able to overcome that by bringing our old friend Landsat. So what Landsat is giving us is, obviously free access to data, a lot of data, slightly coarser data, 30 meter, but still we have seasonal data every 12 days. We can create many different indices as we want. We have many different spectral channels there. So what my students did, they brought in the seasonal information from Landsat. They also brought in the thermal information from Landsat. It's even coarser, but it still provides some important information, useful information. So by bringing in all these, and there are other stuff that I would not bore you with, but there are other stuff like PCA for innate, PCA for Landsat bands, different indices like NDVI or the water index or shadow index. By combining and playing with, it took a long time, but after playing around with for almost a year or so, we finally got something that is defensible. But more than that, I think what took the longest were like creating this set of reference points. We all know that if you are using a machine learning or developing a machine learning models, garbage in, garbage out. The better your reference points are, the better are the outputs. And for that, you really need very high grade reference points. My students spent, bless them, they spent so much time to just pick out all these different classes, but it was challenging for the salt crust because there's not that many yet being the keyword here. So they collected tons of points for both timestamps. Here I'm just showing 2016-17. Obviously, some classes will stay pretty much same, some were changing, so they had to change subset of this. 70% were used for training the model, and then 30% were used for testing the accuracy. For this one, we used a random forest, but then another student of mine, she's using a CNN model and kind of comparing that with other models to see if we can improve the accuracy. So what we did, we have classified images from 2016-17 and also the earlier ones. You cannot see anything at this scale. As I said, the salt crust are not hugely spread over yet. But I'll show you when we zoom in. So we have 9 different classes for now. We'll probably merge a little bit here and there. Our main goal was to achieve an accuracy that is higher than a NAIP only methodology. So the NAIP only methodology, we were getting somewhere around 71 to 74% accuracy. By bringing in Landsat and other PCA or other indices, we could get it up to 87%. And many of these classes have accuracy of over 90%, which is obvious because we have forest, water, pretty easy to classify. But it was challenging to identify these salt crusts, and I'll show you why. But what was important by doing this two-step, that by the change map, we could identify areas that are showing a stunning increase. Overall, it's not a lot. It's some places it's tens of hectares, some tens of acres, and in some places it's hundreds of acres. It's not a lot. But then the increase, the rate of increase, it's like 500% increase within 3 years or 4 years. So I think if you look at the recommendations or management recommendations, that's somewhere we have to kind of turn our focus on, because those are the areas where we want to know what's going on and how to remediate that. Now, as I mentioned, that one of the lowest accuracy classes was salty soil, what we are calling salty soil, it's the salt crust. When we started using the NAIP image, we are over predicting. When we first presented that data to one of the our stakeholder meetings, people freak out because they're like, no, that's not going to happen. That's too much salt. So we have to kind of decide which way to go. And we made a conscious decision to go for under prediction. So what you are seeing here, the top two are from Sussex County, Delaware. So what you are seeing, these are all, the salt crust, and you can see this are correctly identified within this purple color. This is from Somerset County, Maryland. And you can see there are some places which could have identified as salt crust, but we did not. Now, the most confusion of salty soil is with crop field. So the question is, even if we are under predicting slightly, is it possible to identify this region? Because what you are seeing here are the fringes. So it's almost always surrounding this cropland. So if you are seeing this salt crust surrounding these croplands, so doesn't it mean that the crop field would be less productive even if we do not see the salt crust yet? So that's the line we are kind of taking when we talk to the farmers, and it seems to convince them. So they are actually reporting, decline in productivity, and they are coming and discussing what they can do to stop this. So a lot of work has been done because, as we said, a lot of places in the western part of the US already experience that. What's different in the Chesapeake Bay or in the Delmarva Peninsula is that it's different ecosystem. So here, it's not just salty, it's also wet. So some of the recommendations that might work in other ecosystems might not work here. So some of my collaborators are looking into salt tolerant species. Obviously, you have to change crop species. They are looking at plants that can incorporate saline water, for example, Spartina. Some are looking into plants that can tolerate some soil, some salt, and some flooding. And then there are some species that can tolerate salt, but not flooding, because there's a gradation. So in some areas, it's very wet and very salty. In some areas, it's salty, but not too wet. So we have to come up with a kind of a portfolio of different crop species that can survive this. There are talks about implementation of various conservation easement program or soil health practices like riparian forest buffer, irrigation water management, shoreline protections, but also changing field management practices. Like you probably can allow excess salt to leach. You can leave the field maybe for one season as fallow. Maybe you can rotate with salt tolerant cover crops. As I said, what's important here is to understand the nuances, the differences of different areas. Sussex County in Delaware might be very different from Newcastle in Delaware, definitely different from Somerset in Maryland. So even though we are looking at a larger geographic region, it's important to recognize the spatial variations, a very fine scale spatial variations we have in these ecosystems. As I said, this is being discussed with the farmers. Some of the farmers I talk to personally, they call themselves recreational farmers. So they have been kind of donating their lands that are already, they say, gone to research. We are very grateful to them. But then I'm also interested to know who are non-recreational farmers, what they are thinking, which of these management strategies would be acceptable to them. So with that, I would really like to thank two of my students, Vishruta Yavatkar, who is a master's in data science student, and Matt Walter, PhD student. They both had a lot of input and feedback into this research, but really all my students in our research group, they really keep me sane. I would also like to thank all the funding agencies that have supported both our India work and the Delmarva work. And with that, thank you so much for your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to send me emails. I'm also on Twitter. If you want to reach out to me there, feel free to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Pinky. We're going to take a moment and listen to all the applause for a nice talk. Thank you for that. It's really great to see the work that you're doing. I know I've seen some of the India work, but it's nice to see the updated versions, the more recent work that you've been doing, and the really innovative stuff, the creative stuff you're doing in Delaware as well. So thank you. We do have one question in the chat, and it's actually a few questions. Frank, if you're interested, I can just turn on your microphone and you could ask the question if you're there. Why don't I go ahead and do that? Or you want to go ahead and ask your questions?
Sure, Dan. I don't know if you can hear me, but I was just curious on the issues with water rights being extracted, if that was an issue there in your research, and if they were maintained, and basically if you could do green LiDAR, you know, if there were water changes in the canal, those kind of things, if that was part of your research.
Yeah,
So the India project.
yeah. So I was actually reading through your comment, Frank. Yeah, you are right that, you know, there are water rights issues. Many of it is kind of governed by the government. Based on my interactions with these farmers, it happened in many different ways. So there are canals. These canals are already established. There are dams and reservoirs that actually hold the rainwater, and then the governments pretty much decide when to release water through these canals. But that's not all. There would be sort of an not just auction, but the villages, they have to put together a pool of money, and then they have to take it to the village level admin, give that money, and then they will get the right to get water from that canal, right? It's not that straightforward, because as I said, even when you get it, and it's very expensive. So even when you get that right, it's not equitable. Not all farmers are getting access to that water, even though at a village level, you're supposed to have access to that water. So you can get water from the canal, but how do you do that? So the wealthier farmer would probably purchase this motorized pump and then basically sell hourly. You know, they will charge hourly to get that motor time, right? So it's an added kind of expense for many farmers. So if you are very close to those canals, you can probably carry some bucket of water and water your field, especially if you are a small holder and if you have a little bit of field, you can probably still do that. If you're further away from canals, that's not a feasibility. So that's the reason why we are seeing this fluctuating trend in winter cropping, because it's not just the water rights, but it's also the geography and also obviously the economic background of these farmers that determine whether they would have access to water or not. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And there was just one other little piece was when the water from the canal comes in, is there any raising of the ground level like in southeastern Washington that has happened over 40 years?
So I have not seen a lot of that. But again, it depends on where you are. I have not seen all of India yet. That's one of my life goals. But the places that I have been to, I have not seen that a lot.
Thank you, and enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.
So we'll continue with questions if anybody has any more questions. But Pinky's also agreed to stick around once we've done with the Q&A for the talk if there are other questions people have about anything, career, remote sensing generally, whatever. I'm sort of curious, you presented in the India work both really cool work on identifying winter cropping and the dynamics of that, and also the availability of groundwater. And I wondered if the availability of groundwater from year to year is at all shows up as a constraint affecting winter cropping. And you mentioned cost, and maybe it is the case that it shows up through additional cost. But are there actually just limits on the resource that are affecting winter cropping?
So I think it doesn't have a straight answer. So it's complex. The data that we used, that's the minor irrigation data. So that's the irrigation area under irrigation and area under different types of irrigation. So we are taking care of the cost issue through that already. However, cost would definitely impact, because irrigation is not the only thing that you'd need for winter cropping. You'd also need your monsoon crop to be harvested and sold at the right price. If you have a bad monsoon, that means you do not have enough money to go for seeds or even labor. So labor is a big deal. The reason is, as I said, that some farmers, they travel to nearby towns during winter or even summer, so that they can gather more money that they can remit to their villages or to families. Now, if they are leaving, it's most of the time they are younger male. So if they're leaving the villages, that means the families do not have people to work on the farm. So that's when they need laborers, agricultural laborers. Now, there are people in the villages who can do that for you, but for a price. So if you do not have the money for that, probably you do not have, even if you have the irrigation access per se, you probably cannot go for that.
Mhm. It's such an interesting example of a coupled natural and human system where you have natural dynamics and resources affecting the outcomes as well as the human dynamics. And I really appreciated the way you started and told your description of the work as a story. And I'm curious, is that an approach that you have found to be particularly useful in getting purchase on these coupled natural and human systems? This sort of narrative that you're telling is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, so as I said, I was born and raised in urban India. So before, like the first time I really was out in the nature was one of my field trips for my undergraduate times, when you take geology courses, field courses. That's really the time when I really got into this nature. Growing up in a town did not give me enough opportunities to talk to farmers or even forest dwellers. So when I started going there on a regular basis and talking to people, that's something that struck me the most, because when I started this work, it was mostly focusing on the natural component, right? How climatic impacts are kind of affecting this. So we were, talking about climatic projections, like how precipitation is going to change, how temperature is going to change. So I would often go to these farmers randomly, and they would be so generous. Like they're like most generous people I have seen in my life. They would sit me down, they would feed me, and then I'll talk to them and I'll ask them, so this is what scientists are saying, that temperature is gonna change like this, or rainfall is gonna change like this. What's your plan? Do you have an alternate plan in for 10 years down the road, or 20 years? Like, what about your kids? What about your grandchildren? And they would look at me and like blankly, and they would say, we don't have any plans. We will die if that happens. And that struck me. And I was like, wow. I mean, it's one thing you read about all this stuff and you talk to people and they're literally telling me, I'm gonna die. My family is gonna die because I don't know what to do. So that's when, I got kind of interesting is really not, it's not the word that do justice, but it draws my attention, and I started kind of going back there in the landscape and kind of trying to understand. It's a complex system, and everywhere it's different in Vietnam, it's different in Bangladesh, it's different in central India compared to Western India. So it's a different story everywhere. And I hope that with my work, collaborative work, definitely, it's a story that we could tell to people everywhere. I used to teach at CUNY as an adjunct, and I would talk to my students, and they are, New York City kids going to Trader Joe's for, good food. They will often debate me with organic farming and other stuff. And when I tell them this, that's always have an impact, because it seems so distant that you are getting your food somehow, but what happens when these producers are consumers? What happens to them? Are they getting enough food for themselves? So I feel like, whenever I give talk, I always bring in that human component, because I feel like that's how you get the most impact. And I think that's needed for us today, in today's world.
It's such an interesting distance in my mind, but so important to bridge from remote sensing, which is this literally seeing the earth from space, to hearing these stories on the ground and integrating those perspectives. Jen Weiss in our school here comments, it's so crucial for science to reach the people on the ground, literally. And how do you struggle at all with sort of how you bring that remote sensing information and how you summarize that, the water index or the NDVI and the dynamics? How do you communicate that, or do you try to communicate that to the people on the ground?
It's getting easier because everyone has a smartphone and they know about megapixels. So I always, it's funny because I came up with this little story in my head, and I have been trying that with everybody everywhere, and it seems to grab their attention. So I always tell them, think about the pictures you used to take with your flip phones, even if that had a camera, and think about your smartphones and how that's taking pictures. So they connect to that literally, and it's literally the same concept. Number of pixels, the details that we have, and most of the times I don't even have to tell them anything. It's me learning from them. So all the time, whenever I go out in the field and talk to them, I'm learning every time something new. So I literally try to go out there to learn new things, but also I don't find it challenging to communicate with the farmers or the stakeholders because they are experiencing it. This is the lived experience. I find it challenging to convey that message to policymakers or decision makers, because many times that decision is being made in an office somewhere else. Maybe someone like me who was born in an urban place have no idea what goes on the field. I have never even lived a day, never even gone a full 24 hours without food. So that's what I find challenging.
Interesting. Well, thank you for sharing your work and perspectives on research on farms and with remote sensing and with interacting with people. I really appreciate your spending the time with us. I wish we could have you here for a visit and have some dinner together or whatever afterward, but we have been sort of stopping the recording here, and if anybody wants to sort of come into the conversation and just have a more informal conversation, we'll stop the video now and